Another figure who died that's a little closer to the kind of thing we generally talk about on here is Ward Churchill. And I want to talk about Ward Churchill a little bit because I have at times been very harshly critical of Ward Churchill. And at other times in my life, I've been a huge Ward Churchill fan. And in the past couple of years, I just, I was actually in his presence quite a bit in the last 2 years because of the Uhuru case. And I honestly, I can say I respect the man, um, and I respect the man. And while I don't agree with many things he's done over the years, I do strongly agree with many things he's done over the years. And I mean, he was somebody that I was really studying as I was getting political as a teenager. So I'll just say I respect Ward Churchill and I mourn his passing and I take my hat off to all the good things he did, all the great stances, like the Uhuru case. Ward Churchill, I first heard about Ward Churchill because I was a high school student and Fox News canceled him. Cancel culture started before Facebook, before Twitter, and it started on Fox News. He was a professor. He was the head of the Native American Studies Department of the University of Colorado. And Fox News, Bill O'Reilly's show, did 100 episodes about him in a row, right? For 100 days straight, they talked about him. And it was because he had written an essay after 9/11 called "Some People Push Back," arguing that basically pointing out that the USA had killed a lot of innocent people, about 500,000 innocent people, with sanctions on Iraq, and that it was genocidal what the USA had done, and that it would make sense for the Iraqis to retaliate against the United States with something like 9/11, right? If they were facing that kind of terror, they would respond that way. And so Fox News covered this endlessly. Oh my God, this Native American professor who, said the 9/11 attacks were justified. How dare he? He called the people in the Twin Towers little Eichmanns. Oh my God, they went after him. I hated Bush, and I hated the war in Iraq, and I was interested in anybody who was a socialist or a communist or a far left critic of the Bush administration. So I immediately became a Ward Churchill fan. When I was 16, 17 years old, I got on the internet. I downloaded every Ward Churchill speech I could get my hands on. I went to Borders, which was a chain. It used to be there was Barnes and Noble and Borders. Borders closed down. Now there's just Barnes and Noble. There used to be Borders. I went to Borders and I bought A Little Matter of Genocide, and I bought On the Justice of Roosting Chickens, and I was a huge Ward Churchill fan. And I thought kind of like a third worldist, right? And Ward Churchill's politics were very, quote unquote, third worldist, right? He basically believed that white Americans were settlers. They were bought off. They had no revolutionary potential. And at the time, I was very, very interested in the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP. And I noticed that almost every book that Ward Churchill wrote had a couple paragraphs lashing out at the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was interesting. Ward Churchill he was a prominent Native American scholar who, is part of he was part of the left, the far left of the 1990s, I guess, right? He wasn't as well known, I should say, as Howard Zinn, as Noam Chomsky, but he was a prominent academic as the head of the Native American Studies Department, as a prominent Native American scholar. And he was anti-war, and he had written the COINTELPRO Papers, which is a great book on the history of FBI repression. And he was just a kind of far-left professor who was at far-left events. He went to the Anarchist Book Fair every year and gave a talk in San Francisco, and he was just a far-left guy. Fox News discovered him and went after him. And that's how I heard about him, and I loved his stuff. And I first met Ward Churchill at the U.S. Social Forum in 2007, and I remember I was late. I was speaking on a panel about Che Guevara with my friend Mike Martinez, who is now a CPI member, and I was late, and so I was running to get to the forum. I wanted to get there on time, and I ran around the corner, and there was Ward Churchill. And not surprisingly, he's a very tall man, and he was very tall, and he was shouting at an RCP woman, a woman holding an RCP newspaper who was very short. And he was yelling at her, and I just thought, that's Ward Churchill. That's so cool. That's famous Ward Churchill. So then the next time I met Ward Churchill was at Mumia Abu Jamal's court date. I think it was 2009, 2010. Mumia Abu Jamal had a court date in Philadelphia. I drove to it with comrades from Cleveland, and there was Ward Churchill. I introduced myself. I said, I first heard about you on Fox News. You know, Bill O'Reilly went after you, and I learned all about you. And he said, yeah, Bill's good for that. Shook my hand. Okay, now, you know, I learned later about his position on Nicaragua and how he had been very, very, very much opposed to the Sandinistas of Nicaragua and had basically worked with the CIA against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And so I became very, very harshly critical of that. And in some of the early writings of CPI, we're talking decades later now, I actually spoke quite harshly of him because I kind of equated his position of, saying that white workers in America are the enemy with the position that he took regarding the Sandinistas. Basically, in the 1980s, he, as a Native American, as an indigenous activist, he took the position that the Sandinistas were white Marxists and that the Sandinistas were violating the rights of the indigenous people of Nicaragua, and that it was okay to work with the CIA against the Sandinista government of Nicaragua. And he openly took that position. And Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who is another scholar of indigenous heritage, has written about, she says he bullied her, and that he, like, her first day on the job at one of her academic jobs, he showed up and started screaming that she was in the Weather Underground and trying to get her fired. And she's written some pretty harsh things about him, which, could be true. I don't know. But he was the speechwriter for Russell Means. And Russell Means, the Native American activist, he became a CIA asset. Especially in the 1990s, Russell Means, was a member of AIM. And as AIM, the American Indian Movement, was being broken apart by the FBI, Russell Means, who was their leader, he deteriorated politically. And they made Russell Means a household name. He played a Native American in like every Hollywood movie, and he testified, before Congress about how Indian reservations were an example of failed socialism. And and Russell Means, was used, went to Nicaragua and made a propaganda film against the Sandinistas. And Russell Means kind of took the Native American movement in a negative direction. Ward Churchill was his speechwriter at the time. So, but then, his book on the COINTELPRO papers is very good. His book about, exposing the FBI's dirty tricks against activists, and, Jim Vander Wall and Ward Churchill wrote a very good book about it. And so in the last couple of years, as I've been supporting the Uhuru movement against the FBI, Ward Churchill was there, and he would be at the same events. I would be there with him. We didn't have coffee or anything like that. We're not on speaking terms. But I do remember when I gave a speech at the Uhuru House right before their trial began. I spoke about the Islamic Akek ring and the smashing of idols and all of that. And I could see in the audience Ward Churchill grinning. He appreciated that. And I think he appreciated that as an indigenous activist. When I was talking about, do we really think primitive man was stupid, that he could carve a piece of wood in his backyard and that was God, right? And he grinned when I said that. He appreciated that, because I think that is a slur on Native people that has been used, that they're stupid. They think that those totem poles they make are gods. Well, no, and I was explaining, it was in my speech I gave at the Uhuru House. I talked about how the idols that people erect stood for principles, right? That they weren't literally worshiping the idols. And he appreciated that point, and he's a Native American scholar, right? He's studied indigenous people and their religious beliefs, so he probably knows what I was saying 1,000 times more than I know it. And so Ward Churchill passed. He died of natural causes. He was a guy from Illinois, grew up in rural Illinois, Peoria, Illinois. He had indigenous heritage, and he fought in Vietnam. After he got back from Vietnam, he was very alienated from U.S. society, got involved in the anti-war movement, and began exploring his indigenous heritage and got involved in the American Indian movement, was involved in some armed activities with them, they carried guns and did some pretty militant stuff. And then he went into academia and he became a prominent scholar of the indigenous studies in the United States. And, uh, you know, I guess where we would disagree is that I generally am sympathetic to countries like the Soviet Union, China, Nicaragua, Iran, Venezuela. I tend to be sympathetic to those kind of governments. He was not. He took more of an indigenous perspective that this is European Marxism. And a lot of that kind of indigenous anarchism stuff is very degrowth oriented. And the CIA does fund those kind of people. And I think, unfortunately, he had no problem. He openly wrote about he had no problem getting CIA backing. It's interesting. Harsh critic of the FBI. Very, very harsh critic, and did great work exposing the FBI. Was a huge supporter of Leonard Peltier, the Native American activist who was, framed by the FBI and locked up. But he seemed to very much believe that it was okay for indigenous activists to work with the CIA if it was to their benefit, and if the target was Marxists, because he believed that Marxism was white and European. So that's Ward Churchill, a mixed figure, But you know what? I was at the Uhuru House. I was at the Uhuru House supporting Chairman O'Malley. He was at the Uhuru House supporting Chairman O'Malley against the FBI. There were some other people there supporting Chairman O'Malley, and there were a lot of other people whose views may be on paper closer to mine. They weren't there. Right? The FBI raided the home of a group of black revolutionary activists, tried to send them to prison for 15 years. And, the Workers' World Party wasn't there. Right? And I found out they weren't there because I was there. Who am I? Right? I'm a guy on the internet. I'm the leader of the Center for Political Innovation. I'm an RT reporter. And they apparently told the Uhuru movement that if Caleb is speaking at your events, we're not going. Well, Ward Churchill, I don't know if he knows the things I've said over the years that are harshly critical of him. He might. I don't know if he knew. I spoke rather negatively of him at various points. He may have known about it, but he said he may have known about it, but he didn't say, oh, I'm not going to support them because Caleb's there. No, he knew it was the right thing. He said the FBI comes after a group of black revolutionaries. I'm going to support them. Well, that shows that he's a little bit more principled, right? The Workers' World Party might agree with me on a lot of international issues, but they are mad at me on a personal level, and there's bad blood between us personally, so they couldn't go and stand with a group of black revolutionaries against the FBI. Whereas, Ward Churchill and I vehemently disagree about Nicaragua, about China, about a lot of things, but when the FBI came for a group of black revolutionaries, he stood with them, even though I was there. Maybe he didn't know who I was, and that's fine. But he didn't seem to have an issue, and I don't know. It's all very interesting to me. So I try to sometimes on these streams I will get very fired up about people that I disagree with. I will get very fired up, and I'm trying not to do that as much, right? Because it just whatever. And like Ward Churchill is somebody that I have vehemently disagreed with a lot of things he said in his life. But in the final years of his life, on the issue that he and I were the most active around, we agreed, and very few others did. So good for him. We both stood up to the FBI. We were both against what the FBI was doing to Chairman O'Malley, and we both saw how darn important it was to oppose it. So good for him. And many other people didn't. So, that makes me think that Ward Churchill, whatever disagreements we might have and whatever criticisms I might have of his work, I mourn his passing. And I say that he took heroic stances on many issues. There are other issues where I don't necessarily agree with the stances he took, but he stood with the Uhuru movement. He stood with the FBI, or he stood against the FBI. He wrote the COINTELPRO papers, which is a great book. He has called out. His book on the justice of roosting chickens It has kind of an extended version of the essay that got him canceled. Some people push back. But then it just has timelines of all the crimes of U.S. imperialism, starting from the 1700s all the way up to today. And it's a really good rebuttal to these people that want to give you a body count. Well, communism killed 100 gajillion million people. Well, his book, he's got the lists of all the crimes of American imperialism, all the people killed in U.S.-backed coups, So I don't know. He's an interesting figure, right? He's an interesting figure, and the fact that he stood with Uhuru makes me respect him. So there we go. That's Ward Churchill.